and welcome to everybody who is just tuning in. You have found your way to our presentation titled Out of Culture and Preservation, a Racial and Economic Justice Movement. We're going to have our program today where Brent Leggs is going to give us a presentation at the beginning, and then we're looking forward to the following discussion. My name is Amalia Leifeste. I teach with the graduate program in historic preservation, which is co-sponsored by College of Charleston and Clemson University. I'm also the current chair of the National Council for Preservation Education. I appreciate everybody tuning in today. And I'd like to mention here at the outset, although I think you've also had a notice pop up, a dialogue box pop up to tell you that you're being recorded, that this presentation and conversation is being recorded, and it will be available for viewing by NCPE members, but also the general public on NCPE's YouTube channel, which can be found on YouTube under the National Council for Preservation Education. We should have that loaded by next week. So as a brief background, the National Council for Preservation Education is a national organization focused on education within the field of historic preservation, as the title indicates. NCPE members are historic preservation programs at universities and colleges, which award degrees, certificates, specializations, etc. NCPE also has associate members, which are organizations engaged in preservation education, but are not part of degree granting institutions. What we think we do. NCPE is set up to NCPE encourages and assists in the development and improvement of historic preservation education programs, coordinates efforts related to preservation education with public and private organizations and interested individuals, facilitates the collection, exchange, and dissemination of information and ideas concerning preservation education, and creates public awareness of endeavors in preservation education. Given the recent major shifts in academia, namely the need to do a lot more online and virtual teaching, NCPE is exploring ways to bring engaging online content to preservation educators, students, and others with an interest in various preservation topics. I'm especially glad this afternoon that this presentation offers an entry point to the discussion on historic and current inequities, including systemic racism in the field of historic preservation. We have three formalized ways to enable a continuation of today's conversation or dialogue stemming from what we hear from Brent Leggs. First is the opportunity to ask questions of Mr. Leggs following the presentation itself. So as you have questions, kindly put them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I will convey as many of the questions as possible at the end of the presentation and begin our dialogue there. Secondly, and most publicly, as a way to engage, the feed on NCPE's website, which is ncpe.us. That website carries a Twitter feed of all of the messages that are tagged with #preservationeducation. That feed updates every hour, so if you are using your social media accounts to talk about, broadcast, share views on this presentation or related topics, please use the #preservationeducation, and we'll have a record of all of those aspects coming into one place, one repository. And finally, if you're generating anything from this presentation for a class or reflection paper, any other format, I'd love to see it. You can email it to me directly, and I'll gather excerpts from the various words and share them not only with Mr. Leggs, but also NCPE's Task Force on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the general NCPE membership. I know that this presentation is part of Brent Leggs' curriculum and public engagement work for Columbia University, and we appreciate that program's support of the presentation today. As one last item before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank Julie Johnson, who deserves our gratitude for piloting the Zoom webinar technology and recording process for us, and who maintains the NCPE YouTube channel to share these videos. Without further ado, a brief introduction to our esteemed speaker this afternoon. Brent Leggs is the Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which is envisioned as a social movement for justice, equity, reconciliation. The Action Fund is promoting the role of cultural preservation in telling the nation's full history, while also empowering activists, entrepreneurs, artists, and civic leaders to advocate on behalf of African American historic places. From a background in marketing, Mr. Leggs attended the University of Kentucky's Master of Historic Preservation program. His early practical preservation work included being project manager for places designated by the National Trust as national treasures. As the project manager for several national treasure campaigns across the country, Brent led the efforts to create the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument in Alabama, which President Barack Obama designated in January of 2017. Over the past decade, Brent Leggs has developed the Northeast African American Historic Places Outreach Program and its theme, the business of preservation, to build a regional movement of preservation leaders, saving the important landmarks in African American history. Mr. Leggs is a Harvard University Loeb Fellow and author of Preserving African American Historic Places, which is considered the seminal publication on preserving African American historic sites by the Smithsonian Institution. Brent is the 2018 recipient of the Robert G. Stanton National Preservation Award, recognizing preservation leaders. Brent has taught preservation courses at the University of Maryland, Boston Architectural College, and Harvard University. He is currently teaching at the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University. We welcome those students for whom this might be assigned reading, and also students from any other NCPE programs and our audience beyond. It's wonderful to now get to hand the virtual mic off to Brent Leggs as we begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Amalia. And I want to thank you for inviting me to share perspectives and ideas today with this audience. And I want to thank everyone that is listening for joining us today. So what I want to do is I'll share a PowerPoint and speak for about 40 minutes, maybe 50 minutes. And then I want to have a virtual discussion with you about the role of preservation, how we leverage the power of culture and preservation as a force for positive social change. So I want to start by sharing one of my favorite quotes. The past and the future merge to meet us here. So Beyonce wrote and said these words on her visual album, Lemonade. And I want you to remember this quote and these words, which becomes a thread in both this presentation and I think in essence in the work that we do in historic preservation. But first, I want to share my personal story, and I think this is important for all of the students. So I'm from a little place called Paducah, Kentucky. Small town, never imagined I would be in the field of historic preservation as a professional. But as I look back over my journey, the first memory that I had that linked race, place, and identity was when I was in the 4th grade. So as an exercise, kind of professional development, my mom would have me and my twin brother introduce ourselves when we were enrolling in school. And I went up to the administrator and I said, "Hi, my name is Brent Leggs." She said, "What's your address?" I said, 741 McGuire Avenue. She said, "What apartment number?" I said, 741. She asked again, "No, what apartment number?" And I look at my mom in confusion and begin to see that my mom is getting irritated. Come to find out, the woman assumed that I lived in low-income housing, yet she had no idea that in 1972, my parents built their first house, a red brick ranch-style house that they were very proud of. At the far end of McGuire Avenue was low-income housing. There was an assumption made. There was implicit bias based on my appearance, and being Black. There is a true connection between race, place, and identity. So when I went to the University of Kentucky, I got a grad degree in marketing. I then went straight to get a master's in business, graduated uncertain about my professional identity. I started to soul search and realized that corporate America wasn't a good fit for me. And so I thought, I'm gonna get a PhD in history. And then I thought, I'm gonna get a PhD in philosophy. And once I realized I needed to speak fluent in a second language, I scrapped that idea. I thought I discovered what my passion was when I learned about a furniture making program inside the School of Architecture at the University of Kentucky. And when I walked inside those walls, I had this random, unintentional conversation with the former chair of the Graduate Preservation Program, Dr. Dennis Domer. In our 15-minute conversation, he informed me that I would be the first African-American to go into the program, first person with an MBA. And because of my interest in real estate development, which was really on trend at that time, in his words, quoting, I can make a shitload of money. 2.5 months later, I was sitting in class learning about architectural history and iconic and Gothic columns and questioning that decision. But thankfully, they had me to conduct the statewide inventory of historical Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. What I learned has changed the trajectory of my personal and professional life. I discovered that in 1912, Booker T. Washington, in partnership with Julius Rosenwald, would together imagine a social movement in response to a crisis in Black education. They would fund the construction of over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. I would learn that the initial designer of these school plans was no other than Robert Taylor, the first Black graduate of MIT. I also learned that George Washington Carver was the original landscape designer for those school plans as well. But most importantly, I learned that my mom and dad attended Rosenwald schools. Can you imagine realizing that one of my personal heroes, Booker T. Washington, a former enslaved American, would, in his freedom, build an institution known as Tuskegee Institute, that he would envision a social movement known as Rosenwald Schools, and that his vision for uplifting the Black community was real and ongoing and had directly impacted my life through my parents attending Rosenwald schools. I remember being at a school that literally was being held up by a tree. As I interacted with this history and the physical evidence of our past, I had this multisensory experience with these places. I could hear the creaking floorboards as I toured that school building. I could see, I could touch. I remember how the sunlight shined through the glass window panes. But for me, I started to begin to understand that there was an untapped potential, kind of a quiet power, a transcendent power. And that was that preservation removes the gap between space and time. That we literally can touch and preserve the idea born in the mind of the legendary Booker T. Washington. Preservation makes Rosenwald and Washington's lives once lived real. There is power in the work that we do. These are the lessons that I learned from that journey. Be open to random conversations and experiences. They literally can change your life. To all the students, find your purpose, understand your passion, and build your expertise. And when you link those three things together, you can affect positive social change in the world. So I started working for the National Trust in 2005 in our Boston office. And so over the last 15 plus years, I have been thinking about the social and ethnic issues in the field of historic preservation. And I want to highlight some issues and opportunities that together we should explore to be able to shift preservation practice. So intentional monuments. These are historic buildings that were constructed with the idea that they would be permanently cared for and celebrated. A building here designed by the legendary architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. This place is of architectural significance. This place is worthy of being preserved. But what about this unintentional monument? Vernacular architecture really represents the majority of African American historic places standing on the American landscape. Inside of this place is where jazz legend John Coltrane spent a week in the second floor bedroom, and composed his greatest composition called A Love Supreme. Inside of this space is where his wife, Alice Coltrane, an under-recognized, accomplished jazz musician, would record her first 5 albums inside their basement studio. This is where they raised their family and expressed Black love. This unintentional monument is arguably as important as a Frank Lloyd Wright designed house. We have to balance what we value: architectural integrity, cultural significance. This is Madam C.J. Walker's Villa Loire. Madam C.J. Walker was born in 1867 on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana. She would say herself that she promoted herself from the wash tub to owning her own manufacturing company and business. In 1918, she built this historic and elegant residence that exemplifies the American entrepreneurial spirit. It stands in Irvington, New York, literally on the same street as J. Gould Lyndhurst and 3 miles from the John D. Rockefeller estate called Kikit. This place was designed by the architect Vertner Tandy. He was a co-founder of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. This building was listed as a National Historic Landmark in 1976. Reason being for its architectural significance. It was not listed because of Madam C.J. Walker, a woman that would employ and train nearly 23,000 sales agents and beauty culturalists in the United States and South America, who would build a intentional monument where she stated in her will that I leave this place in memory and memoriam to inspire my race to reach its highest potential. It is a crisis in preservation when we undervalue and under-recognize Black women in American history. Richmond, Virginia. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about Confederate monuments, statues, this history. I have two perspectives. One is that they were created as intentional monuments to be used as psychological warfare and terrorism against Black Americans. That they would be placed in public and civic space to demonstrate the power and privilege of white America. That our recommendation as a community of preservationists should be to remove all of these symbols of hate, relocate them to a new landscape, and create a landscape of justice where we provide information and interpretation and where we don't make any investments in their care and maintenance. And as they decay, with their backs turned to our nation, that we begin to measure our social progress by that decay. The other view is what we see here in this image. Who would imagine that these cultural landscapes could be reclaimed and be used to create a new sense of community? There's great potential in developing strategies where communities reclaim space, history, and heritage. "2020 has been a crazy year. Economic crisis, COVID, political chaos, and the tragic killing of so many Black people. We must say their names. We must memorialize and commemorate contemporary historical events. And we have to determine our role in preserving this history so that we learn from our past injustices and ongoing issues of race and racism. Here's what I've learned. We preserve culture and identity. The tools that we use are historic buildings and landscapes, preservation practice, scholarship, research, and beyond. But we preserve culture and identity, not buildings and places and old things. We fight against systems of injustice and inequity, both within our profession, academia, and our nation. And there's a role for preservation in this work. We are reclaiming space, heritage, and we preserve the contemporary moments that redefine a nation. I want to talk about preservation practice. In my journey, I believe that we are now at a place where preservation is more than acknowledging and honoring a privileged few, like our former presidents, white industrialists and business leaders, or slave owners and plantations. Preservation today is activism, and it creates new forms of interpretation and community. So I'm gonna highlight for you one of my projects. So there was a meeting held in 2015, convened by the National Museum of African History and Culture, that included a representative from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, making me aware that there was an impending threat of partial demolition of the A.G. Gaston Motel, a building owned by the city of Birmingham, which sat vacant for 20 years. I had never heard of this place, but to find out that inside of these walls is where Dr. King, Reverend Shuttlesworth, and Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and unnamed civil rights leaders, they would devise a political activist strategy called Project C, the Birmingham Campaign youth demonstrations that happened in the spring of 1963. Just in the corner on the second floor was a suite, historically room 30, which was Dr. King's room. All of those march demonstrations started from the motel. This is where Black men, women, and children who were armed only with the truth in their spiritual battle against immorality would test and affirm the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. That's power. That's worthy of being preserved. On May 10th, 1963, civil rights leaders met with white business leaders to create a truce to end the demonstration marches of 1963. This was a catalytic moment in the American civil rights movement. And it was a moment that helped to lead to the 1964 civil rights legislation. I wanted to show you this image because preservation is about community. The backdrop is 16th Street Baptist Church. The singer on the stage is the artist known as Lettucey. We can link together art, activism, storytelling, and community to engage the public in our work, and most importantly, to remind them of the significant Black history and places that surround them. My lessons. Our work in Birmingham resulted in the A.G. Gaston Motel becoming the centerpiece of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. It is memorialized within our national park system, and it was created by President Obama. When Black politicians, including Mayor Bell and Congresswoman Terry Sewell, Black preservationists, grassroots and professional, we can achieve unimaginable preservation outcomes. We can reconstruct traditional narratives by ensuring that the Birmingham civil rights story isn't told through the lens of violence and pain, but that we are controlling the narrative and highlighting the power of Black communities when we self-organize, develop a shared vision and plan, when we have a sustained commitment to the implementation of that plan, we can change the world. That's our story, and that's the culture that we preserve. I want to highlight for you the work that I'm currently leading at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So in 2017, we remember the tragic events in this moment where white men wearing khaki pants, polo shirts, holding tiki torches around a Thomas Jefferson sculpture on the campus of the University of Virginia. They were advocating in public space to create a new form and system of Jim Crow, a contemporary version of Jim Crow, separate but equal. And in many ways, they are fighting with the belief that their civil rights is being impacted because our nation is becoming more diverse and inclusive. When I look at this image, I see a Black cultural landscape that was constructed and built by Black hands, that is a World Heritage designated site in honor of Thomas Jefferson, but not in honor of the enslaved workers that built this sublime and beautiful landscape and collection of historic buildings. So in response to this event, we wanted to demonstrate that preservation has a role in confronting a cultural crisis in our nation, and that we could demonstrate through the practice of preservation social innovation that helps create better relationships between white America and Black America. The first thing that we did was create a new community of leaders that would advise us and help fund this work. The Action Fund is a $25 million campaign, the largest ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places. We have an esteemed 20-member board and National Advisory Council, which is co-chaired by Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, and the actor and director, Ms. Felicia Rashad. I wanted to share this image so that you get a sense of the national leaders that care deeply about this work. There's a new community of support that's part of this movement. Our signature piece of our program is our grant making and capacity building work. So we have invested in 65 preservation projects across the United States in under 3 years, investing almost $5 million to create new models for preservation, including at Weeksville Heritage Center, an institution that's been around for 50 years. The lady that you see is the legendary activist Joan Maynard, who is the founder of Weeksville. In their 50-year history, they have never had a staff person in a preservation manager's role. So we funded this new staff position, and this person will oversee the stewardship of their historic buildings, the Hunterfly row houses. This, for us, is a new model for building the capacity at African American historic sites. Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C. Many of us understand the legacy of President Woodrow Wilson. who, in essence, segregated the federal government. We want to use our portfolio of National Trust historic sites to reimagine and interpretation and to create equitable ways to tell new stories. In many ways, this is a reclamation project. We worked with Black artists, musicians, and students to compose and create a new composition that highlighted the DC counter Black protest movement of the 1960s. And it was performed using Wilson's piano and inside of his house. This is the future opportunity for preservation to reclaim space and to redefine old narratives. Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia, second largest slave-holding site in the nation. This is currently, if you walk around downtown Richmond, you would have no idea of the history that is covered over by parking lots and pavement and materials. But underneath all of that remains this cultural landscape and memory. The community here envisions a memorial park that links together economic development, commemoration, and this legacy. And this is the conceptual designs that they have envisioned. And I'm glad to say that after 7 years, defeating a $100 million mixed-use development proposal, that the city of Richmond has now included Shockoe Bottom within the city's land use plan, which ensures that Shockoe Bottom will be protected, preserved, and interpreted for the future. Nina Simone. Nina Simone transcended the constraints placed on Black female performers in the 20th century to become the voice of the American Civil Rights Movement. She is a classically trained pianist, jazz musician, but most well known for being the voice of the American Civil Rights Movement. She was born inside of this simple, unadorned house in Tryon, North Carolina. 4 artists came together when the house was threatened with demolition. They created an LLC, and as a form of arts activism and politics, they would buy the house. We partnered together through the Action Fund and are investing significant money in developing a stewardship plan for the future reuse of this space. This will become a national model for the preservation and activation of spaces like this. We're also committed to uplifting the important legacy of historically Black colleges and universities. And we're doing that through a couple of different pathways. So we have a program through our Hope Crew program, which stands for Hands-on Preservation Experience. It's a preservation and practicum program where we engage with students in Morgan and Tuskegee University, teach them preservation theory, and then bring them back to their campus to apply that in practice. And this is our pipeline for cultivating the next generation of Black preservation professionals. We also want to create space for new voices, new audiences to be able to amplify and to support this work. So through our fellowship program, we're working with Brianna Rhodes, who is a freelance journalist. She's writing stories about our Action Fund grantees. Candace Taylor, who is a leading cultural documentarian, whose work on the Green Book, and if you haven't read her recent book on the Green Book, please do, it's amazing, is identifying 10 Green Book sites in Harlem that will be eligible for listing in the National Register and writing stories about these places. We're working with Yoruba Richin, who is a documentary filmmaker. If you haven't seen her documentary on the Green Book by the Smithsonian Channel, I encourage you to do so. She's producing a short doc on the preservation story at the John and Alice Coltrane home. And then we have Jenna Dublin, PhD student at Columbia University, who has supported our equity research report over the last 2 years. We've got to make more space for new leaders to share their perspectives. My lessons learned are, there are so many people that care about our work and our mission. If we find opportunities and engage others in this work, we will become more relevant and extend our reach. Preservation is relevant in this moment. The last bit of my talk is I want to lay out the next phase of the Action Fund and my recommendations for academia. So the Action Fund was a 5-year campaign. We'll celebrate our 3rd anniversary in November, and we will celebrate the milestone that we have completed the campaign and raised $25 million, having supported 150 Black history sites and preservation projects across the country, and really transformed the cultural practices of preservation in the United States. And as I am working on the draft strategic plan for 2.0, this is the question that I want our work to answer. Why do we have to keep telling you Black lives matter? Can preservation play a role in answering this question? So I'm going to share with you the mission, vision, and principles. Our draft mission, that the Action Fund is a movement to reconstruct national identity. We are here to change the way our nation understands the Black experience and to confront the miseducation of all Americans. And we are creating more space for more diverse citizens to contribute to the work of preservation. I decided not to include the number since we are still in draft mode, but substantial investment in the transformation of Black cultural assets to tell the story of the Black experience in America. I'm thinking that we need to be intentional in the way that we frame and even brand our work. The word assets is intentional. Often the view is that Black historic neighborhoods or Black individual sites associated with Black history are deficit-based. That's not true. There's so much history and meaning within Black spaces that are assets that with new investment can be revitalized and contribute to the vitality of these historic communities, neighborhoods, and sites. We have 8 principles. I'll ask you to consider 2 additional principles so that we have 10 in total to be able to really guide the value system that we will put forward for the preservation movement. We got to revere and uplift our history, confront the erasure and omission of that history, make significant investments, partner with intention, and grow the preservation economy in Black spaces. We have to work in partnership, both with the grassroots organizations and individuals on the ground doing the hard work to preserve our collective and shared history, but also with the established preservation organizations and schools that currently retain so much power and influence in the future of this work. We've got to have humility and understand that we need to seek new perspectives and truths and really foster a culture of learning and innovation within the diversity space. We've got to showcase that preservation is racial, social, and economic justice. This is the future of our work. This is where we are relevant. And we've got to continue to innovate our practice, and we have to focus on achieving equity-driven outcomes. That's our purpose in this moment. Some of the new things that I want to share with you. So we have just launched a new HBCU Cultural Heritage Stewardship Program. We will invest $1 million in partnership with the National Endowment for Humanities, the Ford Foundation, JPB Foundation, the J.M. Kaplan Foundation and Executive Leadership Council, where we will partner with 8 HBCUs and fund campus-wide and individual building stewardship plans and collaborate with them through technical assistance and convenings to create a new community at HBCUs, but also to equip HBCU leadership with the information and knowledge to preserve their most remarkable collection of historic buildings and landscapes, and to ensure that this story lives on. We will release in a week, which I'm really excited about. We have spent 2 years on our equity research report that studied and mapped 10 mid-size and major cities with historic Black neighborhoods and communities, from LA to Harlem, New York. And we are exploring and trying to better understand the role of preservation to contribute to issues of affordability, gentrification, displacement, and beyond. And then last, we are having conversations at our National Preservation Conference with Darren Walker, Sherilyn Eiffel, a civil rights lawyer and activist and board member of the Action Fund, as well as Mayor LeVar Stoney, who is the mayor of Richmond, about memorialization, Confederate monuments, and preserving African-American historic places. So in this last bit, I want to talk about academia. Preservation programs are the epicenter of our collective knowledge. It's a space for exploring new approaches and methods. But embedded within this institution are systems of inequity. This is our moment to come together as a community to address inequity and to prove that preservation can be a model for other professions. So these are my questions for you. How can preservation programs prevent the invisibility and undervaluing of Black culture and identity across the American landscape and built environment? How do we do that? How should we organize ourselves to scale up our collective capacity, knowledge, and power to document, interpret, and map the Black experience? First line of defense for mitigating preservation threats is to understand the significance and places that still stand. If we had a national documentation and mapping project of Black cultural assets, that would ensure that we have the information to be able to eliminate those threats and to protect these places. How can we establish a single repository that will be a resource for informing how we preserve these places? And which preservation program will have a dual degree in business and preservation? Preservation at its core is real estate development and business. There's no aspect of what we do that does not have a business component. And what I've seen in my career is that grassroots activists and just preservation in general, we are great at having a moral argument. We are weak at also making a business argument for preservation. Let's strengthen that capacity. And also having dual degrees in African American and Black studies and preservation. So the next opportunity in academia, let's collaborate with each other. Let's set a national agenda for the future of Black preservation. Let's develop a shared vision, quantify our outcomes and goals, and build the needed infrastructure to be able to demonstrate our diversity, our commitment to diversity, and our equity within our profession. Let's leverage this national blueprint, its impacts, the lessons learned, so that we can create more space for the other underrepresented communities that will follow in the footsteps of the Black preservation movement. We must uplift Latino American heritage, Asian American heritage, women's history, LGBTQ history, Native American history, and so much more. I hope that academia in preservation programs that we can commit to make a 10-year commitment to scaling up our equity-driven outcomes so that we begin to control the narrative and to tell the full American story. So I want to come back to this as I conclude my talk. The past and the future merge to meet us here. In this moment, what future are we creating? Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Brent. I'll be the virtual clapper since I'm the only one you can see, but thank you very much for that beautifully paced and some good provocative questions that you've left us with. I have a few questions and some more are rolling in as you've drawn to a close. But I think that this is a good one to start with. It's from Rayad Ashmin. And the question is, how do you see preservation with respect to the technological era we live in? Is it still important to preserve architecture physically? And how can new technologies help with preservation and prompt culture and identity? Do we even worry about buildings?
So we are in a technological era. We've got a better leverage the power of technology as a public engagement strategy. What we've learned with COVID is that technology has been our best friend. Leveraging that technology to share programs and introduce these historic sites and history to the public. I mean, this is a moment of innovation for these places and for our profession. And I hope that we continue to leverage this technology in meaningful ways. And we also understand that many Americans will never have the opportunity to have that multisensory experience inside of a historic site. Someone might always dream to visit the home of Harriet Tubman, and they might live in Japan. Like, our reach is greater when we maximize the value of technology. So do we still believe in preserving the physical architecture? Yes. The way that we communicate history and our collective values is through the physical dimension of architecture. Architecture has exceptional power in bringing to life the history that we preserve. So I'm not saying that we should not preserve architecture, that we need to create more space for also preserving the cultural and social history, that we begin to equalize and have respect for vernacular architecture as well as that's professionally designed. And then last, you say how the new technologies can help in the preservation and promotion. Pretty similar. I think, when I challenged us to think about a national database and mapping project, you can imagine the use of technology and being able to do that, the sophisticated use of technology to achieve that ambitious goal. Technology is our friend, and we've got to be better equipped to use it.
One that might pivot from that, which is a question about how can preservationists identify and celebrate, I might also add protect, sites of immediate importance. So I think this might have been triggered by your slide enrichment, right? How do we capture things that are immediate and maybe ephemeral?
Yeah. So in preservation, in essence, we are preserving not only culture, but we are preserving ideas. We are preserving moments in space and time across geographies. And I think it's our duty and social responsibility as preservationists to inform the community conversations about preserving the ephemeral. When you look at a mural that became a dedicated space to memorialize injustice and to in essence, almost a space for funeralizing the death of George Floyd. That moment, when that cop had his knee on his neck, transformed our nation and the world. It shifted consciousness like the events in the spring of 1963 in Birmingham. We understand that this moment is living history that has to be preserved. And so we need to provide the solutions to communities to be able to say, how do you preserve the ephemeral? How do you preserve the art, the murals, the graffiti that was created in response? And that is literally contemporary and living history. That's part of our work, and we have to explore strategies for being able to do that outside of putting that mural in a museum, but keeping that history, that new history, within the community.
Wonderful. I see two more questions that are a little bit more about preservation education. Let me just scroll quickly and see if we want to. I was sort of trying to put the questions in order of the way you went through your presentation. Okay, so Jessica Baldwin, for example, asks, while we're here a little bit more in the theoretical realm, the way that many laws are written, the physical space is the only way to preserve some of the cultural spaces. Can you suggest methods to make sure that cultural aspects of physical spaces are showcased?
All right, the way many laws are written, the physical space is the only way to preserve some of the cultural spaces. Methods to make sure the cultural aspects of physical spaces is showcased. So I'm thinking about the John and Alice Coltrane home, for example. So the culture that we preserve inside of that space is their love of spirituality. It is the space where he created a love supreme, or she recorded her music. So the way that we do that physically is we are retaining the original wallpaper inside of that second bedroom and are developing interpretation strategies based on its patterns and design. We are retaining the carpet in the spiritual room where Alice Coltrane practiced Hindu and celebrated her spirituality. And the colors of that really reflects her spiritual practice and that culture. We're retaining the original windows because John opened the windows inside of that bedroom to get fresh air when he was composing his music. The physical history and the culture are linked. And so our work is defining how we tell the story and interpret and program those spaces, but most importantly, how we navigate the visitor spatially through the architecture and the physical history so that they have a unique cultural experience that leaves them more empowered than before they visited that site.
Wonderful. I want to end with Olivia Clemens. What about Jesse Kling's question, which is, in what ways can we ensure that business-oriented approaches to preservation, as you've mentioned, are aligned with and not in opposition to the interests of social equity?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So when we were working in Birmingham, now we had to fast track this. You can imagine what I didn't share with you, and I'll share with my students as a more in-depth case study is the city had proposed partial demolition of the motel. We had to fast track the development of a historic structures report to argue significance. We were able to advise the city to go in a different direction. The city had already bonded $10 million and had been working for 4 years on this inappropriate development project. And so we were able to make successful financial arguments to the city by developing a reuse study and feasibility plan that looked at an operational model, developed a program vision, but also tested the operational model and financial sustainability of the proposed reuse. For example, the motel had a supper club, a restaurant. We think it's important because the current location is a food desert, and reviving that kind of intangible cultural practice back into that space as a way to generate revenue. And when we were able to get deep into the financial arguments of how much that restaurant and the other kind of revenue generating aspects of that redevelopment project would capture it was about $80 million of new tax revenue that would benefit the city of Birmingham. So I think that linking business and preservation, it only benefits us to be able to make arguments to funders to say that a historic site has this much financial growth potential, and that we are not solely or 100% dependent on philanthropic fundraising and sources. It is so important when we look at issues of gentrification and being able to empower small-scale real estate developers and entrepreneurs with the capacity to develop conservative pro formas to make those business arguments so that we retain the culture and occupy historic spaces that we hope will revive and revitalize these neighborhoods, but also bring back vibrant and thriving Black main streets and economic centers that once stood in Atlanta and Birmingham and Tulsa and all these places that no longer do. Business practice and preservation must be married, and that is essential for being able to secure the kinds of investments we need to do this work.
Wonderful. I've said that a lot of times. I think related to the answer you gave, although maybe a little bit divergent from the initial question, is anonymous attendees contribution. I grew up in Richmond and I'm currently a Columbia grad student. How do people's obligation to their communities as at a grassroots level, as well as an academic level, conflict or work together? How can somebody doing academic preservation and looking towards their professional career ahead also be true to and work with grassroots level, and are those in conflict or compatible?
No, they're not in conflict at all. And, you know, the majority of programs that I've been connected to have worked with grassroots organizations and communities to do this work. And they have a real commitment to equipping, you know, this preservation audience with the tools and information and documentation and research to be successful. So oftentimes the pedagogy and the way that our curriculums are set up, it can be very theory focused. I think with the right balance of practice and theory, then we are creating students that can be informed and capable of engaging both in language, both in culture, both in having the confidence to be able to work with underrepresented communities and across different cultures to be able to do this work. You know, there was a question here that is asking about integrity in low-income communities. And this is so true. So as I said in my talk, the majority of African American historic places aren't architecturally designed. They are vernacular. They have changed significantly over time, and there has been a loss of integrity. I'm gonna give you an example. So there is the Abyssinian Meeting House that's in Portland, Maine, the third oldest extant Black church building standing in America. This organization, when they first took ownership of the building, wanted to secure recognition and designation via listing in the National Register of Historic Places. It took them years to be able to make that happen because the State Historic Preservation Office was concerned about the loss of integrity. The building, once a church building and religious use, was converted to, you know, multifamily housing. Our response to be able to make the argument and secure the designation was to work with a qualified preservation architect that was able to use the latest technology and to identify the hidden integrity still remaining in the building after pulling back layers of fabric and layers. And we were able to make the argument that this building could be restored back to its original appearance. And the building is now listed in the National Register of Historic Places.
I wonder if that example ties into the question about the Secretary of the Interior standard. And was it a sort of creative way that you worked within those principles or the standards? Are there ways that a new envisioned version of the Secretary of the Interior standards, which our anonymous attendee says are outdated both in their treatments of materials and in some ways in their ethos, were there adjustments? Are there ways that you could picture your work being more easily done on that project with adjustment of our ethos and specifically the Secretary of the Interior standards?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I go back and forth, and I wonder whether or not the Secretary of Interior standards is the issue, or if it's in the individuals that are applying the standards themselves. And but the short answer is I didn't share, but we are creating a space, a innovation lab to explore these kinds of questions via the Action Fund. And I think this is a perfect role for preservation programs to come together and to provide an alternative strategy that creates standards and best practices related to issues of integrity, economic development, related to cultural practices, and that also relates to how we democratize what is deemed worthy of preservation and recognition. And all of these kinds of ideas should be discovered and explored in partnership with preservation programs.
Wonderful. So are there any more questions as you've been scrolling through that you want to call out and address? Otherwise, I was thinking of ending in a similar place as your presentation in looking at the role of education and programs. Jeremy Wells and Dr. Eric Jackson had questions about sort of how to be implementing some of these ideas, recommendations for the curriculum within public history and preservation programs.
All right, let me see. Yeah, so Jeremy poses a really great question. And I think a lot of us in academia have been thinking about this. And I would say that NCPE has a responsibility to act as a convener, to pose these questions and to develop a strategy for responding to a more progressive view of preservation and practice. And I think academia, if we begin to equally value the use of practice in the classroom and create space for practitioners to share lessons learned and strategies, I think this will help to balance the kind of theoretical based approach and understanding of the way that we have done work in the past. And should be looking at the ways that we want to do work in the future. And if we find that kind of balance in our approaches, I think that's going to benefit both academia, but also, the profession as a whole. I think I'll end with Andrew's question, which said, why should we have to do that dance in order to get the Portland church listed? How can we get the long out-of-date National Register requirements changed so that they reflect the importance of the vernacular architecture that represent underrepresented communities? That is, I think, a fantastic question. I think that is a challenge. It's unfortunate that we have to fight this hard to preserve Black historic places and underrepresented communities' history. It shouldn't require that much effort. There are so many problems within the way that we recognize American history. Many of the reviewers at the SHPA level are not equipped to be able to make designation decisions about underrepresented history. We have created a culture where we value architectural significance and integrity over culture, social history, and often what diverse communities value. The federal government itself has contributed to these issues, and even looking at the underrepresentation within the National Register of Historic Places, that is preservation politics. The Action Fund, we are dedicated to fast tracking the work of preservation on the ground today. This is a community that could work to reimagine the systems for preservation in the future that has a focus on diversity and inclusion, whether it is looking at the existing listed sites and amending those nominations, like at Villa Lawaro to recognize Madam Walker, or to be able to create space to ensure that other historic sites don't have to spend years and their limited resources to be able to secure the recognition that these places deserve.
Charge for academics, charge for our work going on, absolutely. I would propose that Olivia Clemens has a nice ending question, which is, thank you so much for this inspiring, powerful talk. Agree. And for those interested in getting involved, either professionally or as volunteers, I think in the social movement at large, where should we start?
So I would say go to savingplaces.org, which is the website of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I would say the first place, or the second, is talk to the chair of your preservation program. Share your strategy for being able to bring more social innovation and inclusion to your program and to your community. Third, I would encourage you to go visit a historic site. And even though we have to, be safe because of COVID, but there are opportunities for grad students to contribute to the preservation, interpretation, and public engagement programming at historic sites. Don't be afraid to volunteer. Don't be afraid to support the work of grassroots organizations and their boards. There are ways that you can create your own community inside of academia and outside of that. And remember the intro of my talk. There is power in unintentional conversations and moments. Make them intentional. And do the work of growing this movement so that we can together reconstruct national identity and ensure that communities of color, that our shared history is revered and respected and acknowledged, and that these places are programmed and activated to be able to ensure that their wisdom lives on to inform present and future generations. You have the power to do that in small and big ways.
Thank you so much for your words. Thank you so much for sharing the work that is ongoing and your charges for students and educators, parts of NCPE programs and beyond. I will save all of these questions and see if we can continue the conversation, keep that going through your classes, your upcoming classes, but also as a part of a larger community, this NCPE convening that you mentioned. Thank you again. I'm sorry it's such an anticlimactic clap to only have me on screen doing that, but really appreciate your time and your wisdom and insight. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Bye.